Good morning, everyone. We're going to give a couple of minutes here so we can get everybody in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get kicked off here in the next minute. So we've got attendees coming in. I would like to also note that if there are any questions that you have throughout the workshop today, please feel free to enter in chat or Q&A. The Q&A section would be best, so that way we can track a little bit better, and we'll make sure that we get your questions addressed as soon as possible. All right. Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and kick off this workshop today. Today, we're having Nerdio with us. Vadim is here. Appreciate the time to take your schedule to come out here and help us out with the community and educate everybody on Nerdio. Our focus today is why build an Azure virtual desktop practice and what Nerdio brings to the table as far as your AVD deployments that are out there. So I am your host today, John Splone. If you aren't aware who I am, typically doing the webinar Wednesdays. So if you want to jump in for those sometime, we greatly appreciate you over there for those as well. I've been in the industry now for 25 plus years, working with the virtual desktop, virtual workspace environment, the whatever slang word or technical jargon you want to use towards it. But basically, I've assisted customers and my own customers with deploying EUC solutions for the best possible user experience out there. A wide range from consultant, admin, all the way on up across the board. So we are XenTegra. If you're not aware who we are in the market space of professional services and also a reseller of solutions, as well as hosting and management of these solutions ourselves. So we work with all of our partners in the community. We were founded by Andy Whiteside. He originally worked at Citrix, worked with Andy for years as a consultant on up into Citrix. And what we do is he decided that there wasn't enough enablement from the partners that were out there to the community, which is really what he builds XenTegra off, was helping the customers, you and your customers, understand the solutions, understand what they're delivering, how and why they're delivering these solutions, to make sure we're optimizing the best productivity, as well as also using disruptive technologies in the marketplace today to deliver these solutions. So with that said, Vadim, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. Again, I appreciate your time being here today.
Thank you for inviting me, John, and welcome everyone to this workshop on Azure Virtual Desktop and Nerdio. So as John mentioned, my name is Vadim Vladimirsky. I am the CEO and co-founder of Nerdio. And what I'd like to do today is spend just a couple of minutes introducing Nerdio as an organization, kind of tell you a bit about how we started and evolved with our current set of products. Talk about some of the value that Nerdio Manager brings to Azure Virtual Desktop and how it can help you deploy, manage, and successfully auto-scale large and small AVD environments, and then really spend most of our time within the actual Nerdio product and actually show you how a lot of these things work and walk you through things like auto scaling and image management and user performance monitoring and those types of capabilities. So let's get started with just a quick background on Nerdio. So Nerdio was actually born out of a managed services provider whose business model was all about hosted virtual desktops. We started doing that in that managed services provider in the mid 2000s, mid to late 2000s, and have done so for several years. And then Nerdio was born as a software product to automate the deployment and management process of virtual desktops. This is obviously all prior to WVD, AVD, Windows 365. So this was all using the RDS technology stack. In 2018, Nerdio's first Azure-based product called Nerdio for Azure launched. And that product was all about helping our partners deploy RDS-based Azure environments, kind of in a very turnkey type of fashion. And this was the year that Nerdio partnered up with Microsoft. Microsoft engineering team was currently working on the RDMI product, which was the predecessor to Windows Virtual Desktop. It was called Remote Desktop Modern Infrastructure, Modern Architecture. I forget exactly what the acronym stood for, but it eventually became WVD, which now is known as AVD, as Azure Virtual Desktop. When WVD launched in September of 2019, Nerdio was a launch partner and had full capabilities in our Nerdio for Azure product. And we started hearing from customers of all sizes, large and small, who wanted to use our technology to stand up their own Azure Virtual Desktop or WVD environments back then. And the product that we had, which was Nerdio for Azure, was all about multi-tenant management for managed service providers. It wasn't really an enterprise-focused product that was designed for very large organizations. And we took that market feedback and created a new product was called Nerdio Manager for WVD. And then when the name of WVD changed to AVD, the name of our product also changed to Nerdio Manager for Enterprise, which is really going to be the focus of our workshop today. So Nerdio Manager for Enterprise is let me pull up the slide that I wanted to share. So Nerdio Manager for Enterprise is a platform that sits on top of Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365 and helps with the deployment, management, and auto scaling of these platforms for large enterprises with deployments that could be anything from tens or hundreds of users to tens of thousands or even north of 100,000 users in an AVD deployment. Nerdio Manager is really designed for IT professionals who are looking to deploy and manage environments with at least several hundred users in most cases. And we do have another product which is really more MSP focused that can be better suited for smaller deployments as well, but that's not going to be the focus of our discussion today. And what Nerdio brings to the table at a very high level is a very intuitive and powerful user interface with lots of automation around all the very complex things that have to be done when working with Azure Virtual Desktop. And we'll get in a lot of specifics and detail around this. But they include things like auto scaling, desktop image management, session management, performance monitoring, storage management, really everything that has to do with Azure Virtual Desktop and is running in Azure can all be done with the Nerdio Manager for Enterprise product. As John mentioned, as we go through this presentation and this demo, please feel free to ask your questions as they come up in the chat, and I will pause it at certain times throughout the presentation and take questions and answer those as they come up. So let's move on and talk about, where does Nerdio Manager fit into the Azure Virtual Desktop technology stack? And Azure Virtual Desktop is a fairly inclusive term that includes several components that Microsoft provides as part of that technology stack, right? So and the easiest way that I found to think about and to really describe Azure Virtual Desktop is it's got these 4 pillars or 4 primary components. There is the client application that Microsoft creates for all the various operating systems that are out there, for Mac OS and iOS and Windows, obviously, and Linux, etc. Then you have the new version of Windows 10 and Windows 11 that supports multi-session capabilities, right? One of the key innovations in Azure Virtual Desktop is the ability to use a desktop class operating system in an RDS kind of way, meaning in a multi-session type way. And that's a really key component of AVD. And on that machine, on that session host VM, you have the AVD agent that is responsible for communicating to the AVD service that's hosted by Microsoft. The next pillar is what we call the admin experience, right? The admin experience when WVD first launched was all PowerShell based. There was nothing you could do in the UI. It was all based on PowerShell, and that's where Nerdio Manager first really added a tremendous amount of value of adding lots of easy to use UI on top of what otherwise would be pure scripting. Now, since spring of 2020, AVD has an admin experience that is based on the Azure portal, and you can do most things, or a good number of things from within the portal. There's still some PowerShell required for several more advanced and automated capabilities, but the admin experience is definitely a key pillar of AVD. And finally, AVD is a set of hosted services by Microsoft, set of PaaS, platform as a service offerings, things like gateways and connection brokers and diagnostic services, and all of the things that Microsoft hosts on behalf of its customers. So we no longer have to configure and manage them on individual VMs. Now, what Nerdio Manager does is it plugs into and extends the admin experience of AVD. It does not replace AVD as a control plane. So, unlike some other products in the market that have their own proprietary control plane with their own client applications and agents that get installed on the session host and their own routing and gateway systems, Nerdio Manager doesn't do any of that. Nerdio Manager is an admin experience extension that adds enterprise capabilities for AVD and really bridges all the gaps and adds a lot of features to make deploying, managing, and optimizing AVD much easier and more cost efficient. So there's no such thing as migrating into Nerdio Manager or migrating out of it, because it's simply an application that overlays on top of Azure natively and discovers everything that's already in place and lets you manage what's already in place, or obviously create new resources and new deployments as well. Nerdio Manager, as we'll talk about in a bit more detail, is an Azure application. So it's not a hosted platform, which means it's an application that runs within each one of our customers' environments. So it's completely isolated and dedicated to you in your Azure environment, and you're not leveraging a third-party hosted SaaS platform to manage your environment. Now, the type of functionality that Nerdio Manager brings to the table is sort of broken into these 3 primary pillars. There's well over 200 features. We're not going to go to anything, over those or anything close to it. We'll just kind of hit on the highlights. But there's really 3 primary categories of benefits. Number 1, it's optimization to reduce costs. And Nerdio Manager does a really phenomenal job of driving down the costs of Azure consumption, both across compute and storage costs. And I don't mean reducing costs by 10% or 15% or even 20%, but cost reductions, as we'll see in a minute, are very significant. An average customer sees a 50 to 75% reduction in their unoptimized Azure spend on AVD when using Nerdio Manager. And those are hard dollar costs month to month that you would realize. And on average, we've done an analysis where we found that an average customer pays for the license of Nerdio Manager. So the cost of the Nerdio Manager license is paid for within the first 6.5 days of every month. So the license is fully covered with the hard dollar savings coming from compute and storage optimizations. And we'll look at exactly how that works and what Nerdio does. The third category of savings is just increasing IT admin efficiencies. AVD can be pretty complex. There's a lot to know in Azure, and there's a lot of scripting. And if you want to optimize and make things be automated, that's not a very easy thing to do natively. And Nerdio really lowers the learning curve significantly and automates so many different things that the IT admin efficiency goes through the roof. It becomes very easy to manage very large deployments with a very small team of engineers or technicians that can manage an AVD deployment. So that's on cost reduction. The second category is all about automation and orchestration to increase the consistency and reliability of a virtual desktop environment. Image management is probably the most common example in this category. And we'll look at exactly how this works in a little bit. But image management in Azure can be complex. It's very flexible, but there's lots of things to know and things to do, many different steps. And Nerdio takes all the complexity out of it, make it to an automatic point and click process with lots of pipeline type automation that's possible. So you can automate things like patching, testing, deployment, all of the things that have to do with image management are handled within the Nerdio Manager platform. We also have a disaster recovery capability that allows customers to take a host pool, an AVD host pool, and spread it across multiple Azure regions. So if one Azure region has an outage and another region is up and running, then users can connect seamlessly into the second region in an active type of a configuration. So there isn't a failover event that needs to take place. And then we also have a monitoring and self-healing engine. And what that does is it proactively monitors the health of all the session hosts in the Nerdio, in the AVD deployment, and can respond and remediate problems as they arise. So for example, if a VM becomes unavailable, it can be restarted. If the agent gets corrupted or the upgrade of an agent that Microsoft pushes out fails, Nerdio Manager can detect that and automatically reinstall the AVD agent. And it can even completely delete and recreate a VM, join it back to the domain, install all the necessary apps, and get it back into the host pool in a matter of minutes without any manual intervention from the user or from an administrator. And then the third category is all about simplifying the management of AVD. And this includes both the initial deployment of AVD, going from nothing in AVD to a pilot, taking that pilot from a handful of users or a small number of VMs to thousands of VMs with a click of the button. So just the entire deployment and migration process is greatly simplified. But also the ongoing management of AVD and everything that AVD relies on, right? So it's not just about host pools and app groups and user assignments. It's all about storage and Active Directory and FSLogix and applications. Everything that AVD uses in Azure is covered and automated by Nerdio Manager. So this is sort of the high level overview of the types of benefits Nerdio Manager provides in an AVD environment. Let's zero in on one of those specific things. Let's talk about the cost reduction component. So, we have, well over 2 million users under management. So we have a pretty good, sample set for data to analyze kind of where typically costs are spent. And what we find is that the top three categories here, the VMs, the operating system disk storage, and the FSLogix storage makes up over 90% of the costs for a typical AVD deployment. Obviously, not surprisingly, and you can see the VMs themselves, or the compute component, is the biggest one here. And this is where we focus at Nerdio on trying to optimize and squeeze those costs as much as possible without impacting the user experience in any way whatsoever. And let's look at a specific example of how that works and the type of impact that Nerdio Manager can have on costs. So what you have here, is a little spreadsheet that shows us what a typical multi-session deployment may cost. So there's some assumptions here on the bottom. I'll just go through these quickly just to show you that this is a very typical type of an environment, and these numbers on a per user basis scale up very linearly as you go up from here. So this deployment assumes 192 users using what we call a heavy user type, or what Microsoft calls a heavy user type, which means you can consolidate up to 2 users per virtual CPU. We're going to assume that we're going to use an 8-core and 32 gig of RAM version 4 Intel-based VM with a P10, which is 128 gigabyte premium SSD disk to give us that good user performance. We're going to assume a 20 gigabyte user profile size, and this is users' documents and their Outlook OST files and whatever else may be stored in their profile. We're obviously going to use FS Logics for encapsulating that and storing it in Azure Files Premium. And we're going to assume that each user will work about 50 hours on average in a week. And then this pricing information is based on the South Central US region. So if you were to deploy this environment for these 192 users in what we call an unoptimized way, just go into the Azure portal, spin up these resources for these many users, you'll spend about $5,000 or about $26 per user per month on that type of a deployment. That's a pretty great starting point. It's not that expensive if you take into account everything that's included here, but we can do much better. We can apply a lot more optimization to drive that cost down very significantly. And we're going to have 6 examples here. The first 3 relate to compute optimizations, and the next 3 relate to storage optimization. So the first one, and the most obvious, is what we call VM power management, just making sure the right VM is on at the right time and it's powered off when it's no longer needed. So that's optimization number 1. Optimization number 2, we call just-in-time provisioning. Just-in-time provisioning allows you to create the VMs before they're needed, shortly before they're needed, and destroy them when they are no longer needed. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, the reason you want to do this, instead of pre-creating or pre-provisioning all the VMs and simply turning them on and off, is because you're still paying for storage of those operating system disks, even if the VM is powered off. So you're not paying for the compute portion of it, but you will still be paying for the storage portion of the operating system disk. And with just-in-time provisioning, you don't have to incur that storage cost. You can have some of your capacity ready to go, so it can be easily and quickly powered on. And then the rest of it can be backfilled on a just-in-time basis. The next optimization we call reserved instance analytics. So, I'm sure most of you are familiar. In Azure, there is a concept of a compute reservation where you can buy and commit to a certain amount of compute capacity in a specific Azure region for either 12 or 36 months in exchange for a discount, a very significant discount. If it's 1-year reservation, it could be 40%. If it's a 3-year reservation, it's about 60%. So it's a pretty significant amount of savings with reserved instances. Now, most people don't think about reserved instances and auto-scaling in the same deployment. Well, if you have a reserved instance, why are you auto-scaling? Why are you shutting things on and off? And if you're auto-scaling, why are you paying for the capacity on 24/7 basis? However, what we found is if you have auto-scaling, even with auto-scaling enabled, there is a certain amount of CPU cores that are used on a consistent basis over the course of the month. Now, the difficult thing is figuring out how many CPU cores there are, because it's not the total number of CPUs, because the VMs are starting and stopping all the time based on user activity. But Nerdio provides an analytics engine that monitors autoscale activity and can make a recommendation of how many CPU cores should be put on a reservation for even further compute savings. The next three optimizations are all about storage savings. The first one, or number 4 here, is called operating system disk auto scale. And what this does very simply is that we're using an expensive premium SSD disk to provide good user performance. But that's only relevant when the VM is up and running and the users are connected and using their desktops. When the VM is stopped, like we would have with this power management capability here, that cost of the disk is kind of wasted because you're paying for a disk that's fast, but you're not using it. No one's logged into the machine. So what operating system disk autoscale does is it can automatically convert from an expensive SSD storage disk when the VM is running to a spinning media, to a standard HDD disk once the VM is powered off, and automatically convert it back to SSD when the VM starts up. So it basically toggles the disk types automatically to make sure that you're never paying for more expensive storage when it's not being utilized. We then have something called operating system disk shrinking. And if you look at the Azure Marketplace and you look at the typical the AVD image, it's going to be 128 gigabytes with over 90 gigabytes of free space on it. And if you want to reduce your storage costs even further, Nerdio Manager can shrink those template disks down from 128 to 64, which is half the price of the 128 disks. And we even have some customers that have made their base images so thin and so small from an app perspective that they're actually able to fit into a 32 gigabyte disk as well. And then finally, we have something called FSLogix shrinking. Now, FSLogix are profile containers that are stored in a virtual disk file, in a VHD file, which is then stored on Azure Files Premium in our example. It could be stored in Azure NetApp files or other SMB storage locations. Now, the thing is about Azure Files Premium is you're basically paying for the capacity that you're consuming. So the bigger these profiles get, the more it costs you. The issue with FSLogix profiles is they always grow and they never shrink. And that is because they're thin provisioned. So that means as a user logs into their desktop and let's say they download something onto their desktop folder or into the downloads folder, that VHD file that is backing that profile is going to expand to accommodate that download. And even if that download is later deleted from within the profile by the user, the size of the VHD file never goes back down. So you have this perpetually growing repository of VHD files that just tend to get bigger and bigger and bigger, even though there may not necessarily be useful data in those files that's consuming so much space. And what Nerdio Manager does is it can automate the process of compression and shrinking of those VHD files to extract the white space from within those profiles and get them back down to the size of the actual data that's stored within them, and removing all of that spare space or the white space inside of those containers. And that reduces savings, or that reduces costs by typically 50%, in many cases much more than that, on the cost of Azure Files, because you now have less data or less capacity to store. And the bottom line here, as you can see, the savings is fairly significant. You are, without impacting the end user performance or their experience, we've been able to take our cost per user down from $26 all the way down to less than $5 in kind of this example, which is an 83% savings. And it's sort of amazing of how much you can reduce the baseline unoptimized spend without impacting the end user themselves. Let me take a quick pause here, take a little drink, and see if there are any questions that have come up in the chat.
We haven't had any pop up yet.
Okay.
Just check on the Q&A side. We're clear as well. So looks like everybody's good to go.
Excellent. The next thing I wanted to touch base on before we actually jump into Nerdio Manager and go through some of these configurations in the product is the architecture of Nerdio Manager. So I mentioned earlier that Nerdio Manager is an Azure application rather than a SaaS hosted platform. What that means is Nerdio Manager is deployed as a set of PaaS, platform as a service services offerings from Microsoft Azure using the Azure Marketplace. So it's a listing in the Azure Marketplace. You can go in there right now, search for Nerdio Manager for Enterprise, deploy it into your Azure AD tenant. It will out of the box come with these 6 Azure services: an app service, a key vault, Azure SQL, an automation account, log analytics, and apps insights. It will use Graph API to integrate with the Azure AD tenant and with any number of subscriptions that you may have in your environment. And it doesn't have any network presence, so it doesn't need to talk via the network to anything in your Azure environment. It's all done through Graph API. And now you have a management platform that can do all of the things we spoke about earlier, and we'll look at in a minute, through this API. And what you can see here is the Nerdio Manager installation inside of this environment will send license metering information, just kind of telling our licensing service how many active users there are and that type of info, nothing identifiable or nothing that could be sensitive from your environment. And Nerdio has no access into your environment whatsoever. So this is a completely isolated, standalone environment that is only accessible to you or anyone you designate. Now, this is a typical, what we call a single tenant deployment architecture. This is the simplest way to install it, but I'll quickly mention that for those customers that have more robust requirements and they have their AVD deployments that may be spanning different tenants, different subscriptions, different and even different Azure clouds, Nerdio Manager has you covered as well. Nerdio Manager supports these 4 clouds that you can see here. It supports the Azure Global and Commercial, right? That's kind of your standard, what we all think of Azure when we talk about it. It also supports Azure US Government, and it also supports Azure China, and it now, as of the upcoming release, at the beginning of next month, will support on-premises deployments of AVD on top of Azure Stack HCI, which is sort of the on-premises Azure version that can be used for AVD. So no matter where you want to put your AVD workloads, any of those 4 clouds are fully supported and all managed from the same UI in a very simple, consistent way. And the diagram here sort of just illustrates one of the ways to do it. You can deploy the Azure Marketplace offer into, for example, Azure Commercial, integrated with Azure Commercial subscriptions, but at the same time, integrated with another Azure AD tenant, and that tenant may even be in a completely different Azure cloud. So I think that's all I have from a slides perspective. I see there is a question that came up. I see a question about Azure Lighthouse integration. No, there is no Azure Lighthouse integration at this time, but all the AVD related Lighthouse capabilities are part of Nerdio plus much more. So we have Nerdio Manager for MSP, which is designed to be a multi-tenant management product that is really used by service providers, which is typically what Azure Lighthouse is used for. And in that scenario, when you're managing multiple customers from the same pane of glass, then yes, you have all of those capabilities. It doesn't leverage Azure Lighthouse per se, but works in a very similar way with all the capabilities built out. Okay, let's see.
We have another question come up. It's, can this assist with the management of Azure Labs desktops?
It does not. It does not integrate with Azure Labs at this time. We've had customers that use Azure Labs and have explored it, and they found with the automation that I'm going to show you and the ability to power on and have non-persistent deployments that get automatically rebuilt as soon as the user logs off, and the cost structure that Nerdio Manager is able to deliver with the regular Azure VMs, there wasn't a strong need to use Azure Labs, at least for the AVD component of that deployment. So it's not something that we've ruled out. It may be an integration in the future, but as of right now, Nerdio Manager does not integrate with Azure Labs.
Great. Looks like we're good right now.
All right, great. Thank you, John. Okay, so now let's go ahead and jump into the actual product. So let's take a look at Nerdio Manager for Enterprise. You should see it up on my screen here. And this is where we can see all the different capabilities that I mentioned. This is really a unified management platform for everything virtual desktop related in the Microsoft Cloud. So you can see we have dashboards and reports that are available. We can obviously manage workspaces and even have backwards compatibility for AVD tenants from the days of WVD Classic, and this can be turned on and off as needed. Windows 365, image management, MSIX app attach, including image creation and certificate management. We have a very powerful feature called scripted actions that allows you to create scripts both as Windows scripts and Azure runbooks and run them at various times based on different triggers and various things like that. We have pretty in-depth monitoring that includes both the out-of-the-box Azure insights as well as much more in-depth dashboards that are not available in Azure natively. We can manage storage and auto-scale and optimize storage. So everything from Azure files and Azure NetApp files and even log analytics, giving you ability to really optimize your log analytics costs to make sure you're not paying more than needed. We have a very robust set of role-based access controls where you can create your own roles or use standard out-of-the-box roles to give different members of your IT organization different levels of access to their AVD environment to manage different things. We have notifications, logging, auditing, and various other capabilities that are in the product. So you sort of get a sense of how broad it is. We'll certainly not have a chance to cover most of this, but what I would like to do is go through an example of setting up a kind of an end-to-end setup of an AVD environment with auto-scaling, and then at the very least show you image management with patch automation on how that works, and then we'll see if questions or more time is available. We can go into other capabilities. So let's start out on the workspaces page. So first thing we'll do is we will create a new workspace, and we'll call it XenTegra Workshop, Workspace 1. We can choose our region. I'm going to put this in the north central US, closer to me. We can apply tags if we want and click OK. And this is going to create our workspace object in Azure. And as I mentioned, because this is an overlay to Azure, if you were to open up the Azure portal, you would now see a new workspace object being created based on these properties we just selected in Azure natively. Then we're going to go ahead and open up that newly created workspace, and you'll see that we now have 2 pages that list our host pools. We have something called static host pools that, for those of you familiar with AVD, this is kind of the native host pool concept, which is a manual collection of session hosts that you can manually add VMs to or remove VMs from. And then we have something called dynamic host pools, which is an extension of the static host pool concept. And this is unique to Nerdio Manager. And what dynamic host pools are is a way to overlay auto-scaling and image management on top of the host pool concept that Microsoft provides. So that's the one I'm actually going to show you today. So let's go ahead and click on Add Dynamic Host Pool and actually start configuring a new host pool in Nerdio Manager within the new workspace we just created. So let's call this XenTegra Host Pool 1. And then we get down here and we have to choose from our desktop experience. We have 4 options here. We can set this up as a multi-session or multi-user pooled desktop. We can set this up as a multi-user remote app, and these 2 can be mixed and matched on the same host pool at the same time using the same image and auto-scaling algorithm. And we have 2 types of single user desktops. Now this one, for those of you familiar with AVD, will look familiar. That's called a single user personal desktop, where each user gets a permanent, persistently assigned VM, and anytime they log in, that is the VM that they're going to be using. And then we have another type of single user desktop called the pooled desktop, which is more of a random or floating or non-dedicated, non-persistent, whatever term you like to use, this is still a VDI type of a scenario where each user gets their own VM for the duration of the session, but it's not permanently assigned to them. That means that when they log off, that VM can either be refreshed back to the image state automatically, or that can be done on a scheduled basis, and it goes back into the pool and another user can consume that desktop later on when they log in. So for our example, we'll go with a multi-user pooled desktop configuration, and then we'll go down to configuring our directory. Now, AVD started out with support for Active Directory only, but there's now several other options. And in Nerdio Manager, we have a concept of directory profiles. There's 3 types of directories that are supported. Active Directory, probably the most common and widespread way of deploying AVD. We have something called Azure ADDS, or Azure AD Directory Services, or Domain Services, which is a Microsoft hosted and managed Active Directory. And now Azure AD Native is supported as well. And you can create various profiles, and each profile can point your VMs to be stored in different OUs, different organizational units within your Active Directory environment. And you can set up any number of profiles pointing at different domains, different forests, different OUs, whatever you need. And then you can designate one of them as default, which is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to select my default profile, which happens to be an Active Directory profile pointing at a demo, kind of a lab organizational unit. We then have a selection of FSLogix configuration. We can either say do not use FSLogix at all and turn it off, or we can choose from an FSLogix profile. And an FSLogix profile, similar to a directory profile, tells the system where to store those profiles, whether it's Azure Files, Azure NetApp Files, a file server, blob storage, whether to use Cloud Cache or not, what options to enable, etc. All of those configurations are part of these profiles that are set up on the settings page. But once you set up a host pool, you just have to select which profile you want to use. And in my case, I'm going to use my default profile. Then we get down to the Hostpool VM configuration. First thing we have to do is give it a prefix. So let's say 0429A is going to be my VM prefix, as well as the prefix of any computer objects created in my Active Directory. I then can choose my network. Now, the network is what determines the cloud, the subscription, and the region of the VMs in this host pool. So you can see here, I have 2 lists of networks. I have one under this Azure government subscription, which is in the Azure government, happens to be, I think, in the North Virginia region there. And then I have several networks in my Azure global subscription, and I have them all over the world. I have East US, I have UK, South Central, and North Central, all different places. And I'm going to select my North Central region network, which is going to be the place where I'm going to create these session host VMs. Then we choose our desktop image. Now, our desktop image comes from what looks like a pretty extensive list of options here in my lab environment, but it really breaks down into 4 different sections. The first section at the top is what we call Nerdio managed images, and we'll spend some time on these later, so I'll skip it for now. Then we have a list of all the compatible Azure Marketplace images, all the various operating systems, Server OS, Windows 10, Windows 11, with Office, without Office, multi-session, single session. You have all the different options selected here. We then have any custom images that you may have already created in your Azure environment will be shown here as well. And obviously Azure Compute Galleries, or previously known Shared Image Gallery images, are listed here as well. So for our example, I'm going to go with the latest version of Windows 11 multi-session with Office Pro Plus pre-installed, and that's going to be the option I'm going to choose. Then I go down and I select my VM size. So in my example, I'll go with a D4S V3, which is a 4-core, 16 gig of RAM machine. And then I'm going to go ahead and select my operating system disk, and this could be standard HDD, premium SSD, standard SSD, or even an ephemeral OS disk can be used. In my example, I'll go with a P10, which is that 128 gigabyte premium SSD disk. I can then choose the resource group where all of these objects will be created. And finally, I can do some quick assignments. So I can do assignment of a user. So let's put a user here, and assignment, oops, select the user here. And then I can also assign a group, security group as well. I can change all of these things later, but at least for now, once I create the host pool, I'll already have these assignments in place. And then finally, we have an ability to apply tags, which seems to be kind of a pretty obvious and simple thing. But if you apply a set of tags to your host pool, dynamic host pool, because VMs and OS disks and network cards get created and deleted dynamically, these tags will automatically apply as new resources get created and deleted on a regular basis. So once you apply these tags at the host pool level, all resources within that host pool are going to be properly tagged, which is really convenient for cost attribution and sort of chargeback purposes on a per host pool basis. So let's go ahead and click OK. This is going to create all the various objects that we've configured up here. But what you'll notice is that even though I specified my network and the image and the VM size and the disk, the one important variable that wasn't specified is how many VMs I actually want to create in this host pool, right? There's nothing indicating here how many hosts I actually need. And the reason for that is because the size of the host pool, how many hosts there are, is determined by the autoscale configuration, which is why the Manage Autoscale page came up right away as soon as a dynamic host pool was created. And this is where we're going to see a lot of those autoscaling capabilities that I was mentioning earlier. So let's go through this configuration. The first thing we'll do is we'll turn autoscale on. And just as a very first change, I'm going to change this 5 to a 3 and click Save. That's actually going to start a provisioning process of 3 VMs in the background. So by the time we're done configuring all this, they may be close to being ready to go. And now let's actually go through and see what we can do from this autoscale page. Number one thing you'll notice on the top left are the settings we specified on the previous page when we were creating the host pool. Now, the important thing to note here is we can change any of these settings at any time and save the configuration, and those settings will apply to any newly created or re-imaged VMs. Obviously, existing VMs will look exactly as they did at the time when they were created, but you can change host pool properties from a template perspective at any time that you want. One specific thing to call your attention to is you'll see here the running OS disk. We set it to a premium SSD, which is the most expensive storage tier. And then we have an option to configure our stopped OS disk. This is where that auto scaling of OS disk comes in. And here we're going to set this to standard HDD, which is the cheapest. It's about 75% less than the premium SSD disk. And what the system will do automatically is each time a VM is powered off, the disk will be converted from SSD to HDD. And every time the VM is started, it's going to be converted back to SSD. It only takes a couple of seconds. There's really no user impact, and it doesn't slow anything down. One other option I want to point out in this section is called automatically re-image used hosts. What this means is that I want my hosts to be re-imaged based on my selected image template every time all the users are logged off of it. And the way it works is pretty simple. Users will log in to their desktops in the morning. Nerdio Manager will monitor which hosts are used, meaning they've been logged into at least by one user. And then if this option is selected, when all users log off, then that server will be put into maintenance mode and then re-imaged and brought back into the host pool under the same name with the exact same configuration, but fully refreshed with any changes that may have been made during the day completely wiped out. On the top right, we have a real-time cost estimator. And what this does is it takes into account the configuration of this entire page. So what region we're using, what VM size, what type of disk, how many VMs there are going to be. And it gives us, using Azure pricing API data, it gives us information on what is going to be my compute and storage costs, what's going to be the maximum and minimum sort of saving or cost. And the maximum saving just means the host pool gets to its largest size and never shrinks, never scales in. And minimum size means that a host pool stays at its minimum size and never scales out. Actual usage will be somewhere in between these two numbers, and we will track and report on that for you as well, but it takes about a week or so of auto-scale data to understand the user usage patterns to provide projected monthly costs that are between these two extremes. So now let's go ahead and actually configure the auto-scaling of this host pool. So the first section here we have is host pool sizing. Host pool sizing defines how small or big a host pool can be. And the first option here is what defines an active host. And an active host could be one where the VM is started and running, or where the AVD agent is responding that it's available and is able to actually receive user sessions. And this is the default and recommended option. We then have something called base host pool capacity. Base host pool capacity tells the system how many VMs to pre-provision and create in this host pool, and basically have available at a minimum in this host pool at all times. Now, it doesn't mean that in our example, all 3 VMs will always be started. It just means that 3 VMs will exist, and the number of VMs that are going to be started will depend on some of the settings we'll see in a minute. The next section is how many hosts must be on at a minimum at all times, meaning 24/7. Think of this as your base capacity to accommodate the number of users that are always expected to be connecting to this host pool. And this number could be anything between 0 up to 3 in our case. In my case, if I select 1, that means one of these 3 is going to always be started. And then finally, we have something called burst beyond base capacity. And burst beyond base capacity tells the system how many additional VMs can be created above and beyond the base of 3 if there is additional user demand. Now, if there is no user demand, those VMs won't be created at all. But if there is, it can go and do that just-in-time provisioning that I mentioned earlier. And what we've configured now is we're going to have a minimum of 3 VMs in this host pool and a maximum of 5, 3 plus 2. And we'll have at least 1 VM always running, up to a maximum of 5 VMs running. And the number of VMs actually running at any given time is going to be determined by the scaling logic component of this configuration. Now, scaling logic basically tells the system when to add and when to remove capacity based on different triggers. And there's many different triggers that are available, and the triggers depend on the type of host pool we are configuring. So because we're configuring a multi-user host pool, we have a certain set of triggers that I'll review in a second. But if we were doing, let's say, a single user desktop or a personal desktop, the triggers would be slightly different because the use cases are different. So when doing a multi-session configuration, we can grow and shrink based on CPU usage, based on RAM usage, based on average active sessions, ignoring disconnected ones, based on a pre-configured available sessions buffer, or based on purely user-driven behavior, where a VM starts when the user logs in and stops when the user logs off, not before or after, but sort of in a very user-driven kind of way. For our example, let's go ahead and choose the CPU usage trigger, because I think that's kind of the easiest one to understand how scaling works. And once we selected our trigger, which is CPU, we're going to configure it such that if the utilization of these hosts exceeds, let's say, 65% for 5 minutes or longer, then the system will begin to scale out, which means add capacity. And it's going to do so at least one VM at a time based on the configuration. And if you had a large host pool, you can change this number to be something else, something bigger, 5 or 10. But what this will do is it will first power on any of the base host pool capacity VMs. And then once all of these are on, if it still needs to continue scaling out because the trigger continues to be, or the threshold continues to be triggered, it can build up to 2 more burst capacity VMs, and again, 1 at a time based on this configuration. Now, imagine the utilization drops below 30%, and stays there for 15 minutes or longer, then the system will begin scaling in, which obviously means reducing capacity. It's going to do so also 1 VM at a time in this example. And the way that will work is it will first remove any burst capacity VMs that were created during the day. And then once those are removed, then it will begin powering off the base capacity VMs until either it reaches a minimum of 1 configured here, or if the utilization settles above this 30% trigger, in which case it will stop scaling in and just stay where it's at. Now, scaling in is not something you may want to do during business hours. For example, if you have users that go to lunch at 12 o'clock and come back an hour later, you don't want to see the utilization drop, remove all the capacity, and then just have to add it back in an hour later, which is why we have a configuration for scaling restrictions. And here you can say, I don't want to scale in until after 6 p.m., for example. So that means that before 6 p.m., even if the utilization drops below 30%, these VMs will not be removed. We then have something called scale and aggressiveness. Scale and aggressiveness comes in 3 levels, low, medium, and high. And what this lets you do is it lets you control and balance between cost savings and user experience. Let me explain how that works. So the default aggressiveness, which is set to high, is going to deliver the maximum cost savings. And the way it will work is as follows. So imagine it's the end of the day, 6 p.m. rolls around, the utilization is 30% or less. The system will say, okay, I got to scale in. I'm going to find the next host to actually remove from the equation here. And the way it will select the host is based on its usage. So if a host has no sessions at all, no disconnected and no active sessions, that will be chosen first. Once all of the empty hosts are scaled in and you're only left with hosts that have disconnected users, it will start turning those off. And then once you have only hosts with active sessions left, it will pick the one with the least number of active sessions. It will place it in drain mode, so no new connections can come in. It will send users a message on the screen telling them, hey, we're doing some maintenance, log off and log back on, which will place them on another host that's not in drain mode. It will give them this many minutes that you can pre-configure, and then it will forcefully log those users off. And it will keep doing so as long as the utilization is below 30% and we have more than 1 host running. So what this will do is it will actually consolidate all active users onto the minimum number of hosts after the end of business hours. Now you may say, well, that's way too aggressive. I never want to disconnect any users who are active on my system, which is why we have medium and low. If you select medium aggressiveness, what that will do is it will only scale in empty hosts or ones that have disconnected sessions only, but never active sessions. And if you select low aggressiveness, that will only scale in hosts that have no sessions at all. So you get a choice and you can balance that any way you want. Now, the next thing is called pre-staging. Pre-staging is really important because there is typically a time in the day, usually the first thing in the morning, when lots of users are logging in at the same time. And when lots of users are logging in at the same time, you don't want the system to reactively build capacity. Rather, you want to pre-stage that capacity and make it available by the time the users start logging in. So let's imagine we have a typical business environment where users are working Monday through Friday, and by 8 a.m., you want to have 4 hosts ready to go. So you configure it just like this. The system will calculate dynamically how long it will take 4 hosts to be ready to go. It will start that many minutes prior to 8 a.m. so that by 8 a.m., you'll have 4 hosts that are going to be running and active and ready to receive users, which in our case means 3 base capacity VMs will be powered on and 1 of the burst capacity VMs will be created. Now, what that means is users will start logging in. They will be equally and evenly spread across these 4 VMs. They'll have a good logon experience. And then as the day goes on, if more capacity is needed, this reactive auto scaling based on CPU usage can kick in and build up to 1 more VM based on our configuration with a maximum of 5. Now imagine it's Labor Day Monday, and at 8 a.m. we have 4 hosts that come online, but no one logs in because everyone is off. And that is where our scale and delay comes in. In this example, we'll say keep those hosts on for an hour, but if they are not used for an hour or after an hour, they're fair game to be scaled back in based on this configuration. So if no one logs in to these 4 hosts on Labor Day Monday, then it will remove them so they're not running and you're not wasting capacity for that entire day. And then the final thing on this page that I wanted to talk about before I take questions is the auto heal engine. So I mentioned that we have this auto heal engine that can monitor the health of the environment and take actions to remediate. So let's go ahead and turn this on. And the first thing to understand is we have something that lets you define what it means for a session host to be broken, right? And a broken host could be one that's unavailable, which means the VM is running, but users cannot connect to it. But it could be several other states. For example, if the domain trust relationship was lost, or FSLogix isn't healthy, or maybe the heartbeat is stale, or maybe it's stuck in upgrading state for more than 15 minutes. You can have various conditions that may be specific to your environment that are an indicator that a session host is broken. You can also specify whether a host can be considered broken when it has active sessions, when it has no sessions, or when only it has disconnected sessions. And then you tell the system, okay, well, if you detect a host in one of these states, don't jump to conclusions too quickly. Maybe it just was restarted, or maybe something transient is happening. So wait this many minutes before taking the first action. And then once this number of minutes pass, then the system can begin its recovery and remediation process. In this example, the VM will be restarted first. After being restarted, it will wait for 10 minutes and see if it leaves the broken state and becomes healthy again, in which case it's done. If not, it will be restarted again. If not, it can be deleted and recreated. But let's say instead of deleted and recreated, we wanted to reinstall the agent. So let's see, we want to restart. Restart, what's the name of that script? Here we go, restart AVD agent. So instead of restarting it twice, maybe we want to, before even restarting it once, we want to restart the AVD agent services before rebooting the VM. And let's say it happens, it restarts the agent and the VM is still broken, then it will restart it. But now let's say we want to reinstall the AVD agent before deleting the VM. So again, here it will restart the agent, restart the VM, then reinstall the latest agent, and only then it will delete and recreate the VM to recover from this particular broken state. So this is a really powerful way of automatically responding to common issues in AVD session host environments and remediate them based on your configuration. All of these actions are scripted actions that some of them are built in and come out of the box, like the ones you see here, but you can also create your own. So there's something specific in your environment that occasionally kind of needs a kick to get back into a healthy state. You can create your scripted action right here, and it will be available to you from this drop-down where you can select that as part of recovery action sequence. So I'm going to go ahead and click close, which is going to save all of this configuration we just applied, and you will see it now that it's applied to this new host pool that we created. And what you'll notice is we've requested a capacity of 3, but because this is a brand new host pool, we currently have 0 hosts in the environment. And as a result, we have 3 hosts that are being automatically created for us. We can check on the details of how that's going. We can click this details button, and it will tell us everything about what's happening. It will tell us the configuration it's using, what Active Directory, a profile, what FSLogix config. You can see that the VM was created, it was joined to the domain, the monitoring configuration was set, FSLogix was installed and configured, and it's going through its typical build sequence of all the different things, including software installs. If you wanted to do it at this stage, you could do, or you can load your software on the images or use MSIX app attach to load software packages upon user login. So I see there are some questions in the chat. I'm going to pause here and see what those are and try to answer them.
Sure thing. So our first question is, can Nerdio connect to a monitoring service such as Logic Monitor?
There is not a native connector for Logic Monitor, but Nerdio Manager has both the ability to make API calls out and has a fully open REST API that can be used to, to trigger things. And basically everything you're seeing me do here from the UI can be done through the REST API feature. Yes.
Great. And then the next question we have is, and Chad, there's no dumb question except for one that's not asked, but when re-imaging used hosts, assuming native domain membership is used, what happens to the machine accounts? How does Nerdio handle that?
Great question. And machine accounts in a typical native AVD deployment is a bit of a pain point, right? Because you have to create net new VMs, drain the old ones, move the users over, and then clean up your AD from the hosts that no longer exist. By default, in Nerdio Manager, you will reuse the same computer objects within your Active Directory. So any re-image operation will reuse everything about that VM, including the computer object, including the IP address. DNS names will stay the same. The VM name will stay the same. Any networking properties applied to the NIC will stay the same. So really the only thing that's changing is the C drive based on the image that's selected.
All right, it looks like between that and the Q&A, that's everything we've got covered right now for questions.
Great, definitely keep the questions coming. Certainly things that are relevant for your environment, or even conceptual things. I'll be happy to take those. So the next thing I want to talk about is image management, right? Image management, as I mentioned earlier, in Azure is a very powerful, flexible, but at the same time complex process. There's lots of steps. You have to create a VM, you have to sysprep it, you have to capture it, you have to version it, replicate it, all kinds of things that need to be done. And it's not the easiest thing that can be done at scale by lots of people. So Nerdio has made very significant investments into the image management functionality, and their image management is very complete and very simple. The way to think about image management in Nerdio Manager is to think of managing a VM and let Nerdio handle all of the backend processing to make it a deployable Azure image. So what I'd like to do is show you a few things. First thing I want to do is show you how to create a new image in Nerdio Manager. Second thing, I'll show you how to manually manage one, log in and make changes and then deploy those out. And then the third thing I want to show you is how to automate that process completely start to finish, where you can have an image automatically get packaged, get created, get updated, sent to a validation host pool, checked and validated, and then automatically sent to a production host pool. So let's start out with creating a new image. So I'm on the desktop images page here. You can see I have all sorts of different images with different configs. What I'll do is I'll go down here to the bottom and click on add from image library. And when I click on that from image library, I can give this a name, a description, select the network where the associated management VM will be created, which will also determine the region of the default image. We can choose the starting point, which image we want to start with. This could be a marketplace image that we talked about, could be a custom image, a shared image gallery image, whatever. We then choose our VM size, OS disk, and resource group. Again, this is for the management VM. Has nothing to do with the session hosts we'll be deploying from this image. This is just what VM size we want to use to make changes to our image. Then we get to choose whether we want our image to be joined to AD or not. And if it is joined to AD, we can specify what profile to use. And the reason you can choose different profiles here is, for instance, you may have an OU that's specifically designed for images where certain GPOs don't apply, and you can easily create an Active Directory profile, select it from the list, and that's where it's going to be domain joined. Then there's several optimizations you can apply. You can apply time zone optimizations. You can set the system time. You can even install certificates from the certificate library that Nerdio Manager maintains for you for things like MSIX when you have self-signed certs. And then you can decide where to distribute this image to. So here we have geographic distribution and Azure Compute Gallery usage. So we can select, let's say, an existing Azure Compute Gallery, or actually create a new one right from here. So in my case, I'm just going to select an existing one. Then I will select what regions I want this to be in. So let's say I want it to be in Central and East 2 and West 3 or whatever, right? So I have all the different regions selected. And then I can actually run scripted actions to configure my image any way I need it to be. So for instance, let's say I want to install Chrome and Teams and Office and Zoom and whatever else you can think of that can be scripted. There's dozens of these that come out of the box in Nerdio Manager, but you can certainly create your own. These are just PowerShell scripts that you can use these as examples. You can choose in what order these things happen. And then once you click OK, the entire process will be done for you. A VM for management will be created. The apps will be loaded on it. The domain join will happen as needed. Sysprep will run. Capture will happen. It will get put into the compute gallery, replicated to the 4 regions. And in a few minutes, you'll be ready to go to deploy from this newly created image. So that's kind of method number 1. As you can see, really straightforward, 1 page to fill out with all the different optimizations and customizations that you may need to apply. If you have a VM that you like, that already has all your software, and instead of choosing an image as your source, you want to create a desktop image in Nerdio from an existing VM, you can do that as well. It pretty much looks the same as the previous page, with the exception of, instead of selecting an image from a dropdown, you're going to be pasting a SAS URL, which is obtained by going to the Azure portal, stopping the VM that you want to import, going to its OS disk, selecting disk export, and choosing the and generating SAS URL, and then pasting that into this box right here. Everything else pretty much works the same as the previous config. And then the final thing, the way you can create an image is by cloning an existing one. So for instance, you can say, here I have a marketing image 01. I can say clone. I can call this, marketing 02, and I will have an identical image. I can move it to a different network and apply different customizations to it. But that's the third way to create an image in Nerdio Manager. So again, creating it from an existing gallery, compute gallery, or custom image. That's method number 1. Using a VM as the source to create an image here, or cloning an existing one. Once the image is created, there's 3 simple steps to managing it. Step number 1 is you power it on. So you click power on. When you do that, you have the option to take a backup of that VM. The reason it comes up at this point is presumably you are powering it on in order to make changes, and it's a good idea to take a backup before making changes. So here we can say, okay, take a backup and retain it for 4 weeks, or I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to click OK. That will power on our marketing image. Once it's on, it's green like this, we're going to RDP into it using the IP address or the name that we see here, or use whatever tools we're typically used to for managing VMs, whether it's SCCM, our RMM, or whatever tools we need to make changes to this VM. That's step number 2. And then finally, step number 3 is clicking this button that says power off and set as image. Clicking power off and set as image and clicking run now will take all of those changes that we made and package them up into an image. And then that image can be rolled out to your host pool as soon as this operation is done, which should take about 12 to 15 minutes or so. There's other things you can do. You can run additional scripted actions. You can take a backup of the current image. You can apply changelog notes here, so you can track and report on who made changes and what changes they made. So there's lots of other things you can do, but at a high level, this is the manual process, kind of manual in quotes, of managing an image. Step number 1 is you power it on. Step number 2 is you connect to it and make changes that you need to make. And step number 3, you click the button that says power off and set as image, and the entire process happens for you automatically. Let me pause here and see if there are any questions before I move on to how do you now take this image and roll it out or deploy it out to a host pool.
So we're clear on questions right now.
Great, thanks, John. Okay, so let's imagine we now have this new image called Marketing 01, and it was recently updated, and now we want to actually apply it to the host pool we just created. So let's jump back into Workspaces, go into our workshop workspace. Here is our host pool. You can see the add hosts task is complete. We now have 3 running hosts, even though no one's logged into them because we are prior to 6 p.m. That's why none of them have been shut down yet. And I'll show you here. Let's go into auto scale configure and change the restriction to be anytime. And you'll see then within a minute or two, or probably even less, it will begin the process of powering off 2 of these 3 VMs, one at a time, because no one's logged into them. So it meets the condition of being shut down. So we'll see that happening in just a minute. But what I wanted to show you is how to take the marketing image and apply it to this host pool. Because when we created the host pool, recall that we used the marketplace image without any of our custom apps on it. Now I want to apply my custom image. So I'm going to go to this dropdown. I'm going to select hosts. I will select re-image. From this box, I'm going to choose my marketing image right here. I could also resize my VM or my OS disk at the same time, which I'm not going to do. I'll just leave it as no change. Here I can select how many hosts I want to process at the same time. So imagine I have 20 hosts in the host pool. I may not want to do this all 20 concurrently because then nobody can log in while that's happening. But I also don't want to do it one at a time because that's going to take very long. So maybe I do it 5 at a time, which is going to be 4 groups of 5 on the host pool of 20. I can then specify how many failures can be tolerated before the operation aborts. So imagine, there is Azure capacity issues, or there's a problem with the image. You don't want the system to go through all of your hosts and realize that, okay, well, the re-image process failed. So you can tell it, hey, stop after you see 1 or 2 failures. So the rest of the VMs are safe, and you can set up alerting and notifications and all of this stuff. And now if I were to click run now, that would go through and re-image the 3 hosts that I created in this host pool with this new marketing image, and they would now have all of the changes that were made to this image. Now, if this is a production environment, I certainly don't want to click run now because that is going to disrupt my users, because now it's 11:17 a.m. here in Chicago, so that that's likely when users are working. So we have this option to schedule this operation, and we can say, instead of running it right now, schedule it to run at 1 a.m. the following morning. And instead of it being a run now operation, we're now going to click save and close, which will create a scheduled task. And that scheduled task is going to then wake up at 1 a.m., go through the reimage process. So by the morning, the users are logging into the new version of those VMs. Now, when this process happens, as I mentioned earlier, these VMs don't get fully deleted and recreated. The only thing that gets impacted is the C drive. So the computer object in AD is the same, the VM name is the same, the IP address and the NIC, the network card in Azure, is the same. Anything has to do with networking is the same. So you really have a very consistent environment when this operation is done, in contrast to doing it natively by creating net new hosts and then having to clean up and move users around and worry about those kinds of things. Okay, so that is how you take an image, create it, update it, and then roll it out. Sort of again, in quotes, a manual process with clicking. Now I want to show you what that would look like if you wanted it to be completely automated and done for you by Nerdio Manager. I see there's a question.
Yes.
I'll take that.
Sure thing. So Ronnie's asking, part of the Nerdio partnership, can we outsource certain migration efforts? For example, for more advanced environments, the client may have a web app that needs to be moved to Azure. Can we white label efforts with Nerdio Cloud Team?
Great question, Ronnie. So, the answer is that Nerdio is a software company, right? I mean, our job is to, write great software and hear from our customers and partners as to what else we can do to make their job easier. We don't typically do professional services, but we do partner with great companies like XenTegra that I'm sure, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, John, but I'm sure can assist customers with those types of services or using our technology. So I guess that's the short answer is we don't provide professional services, but we definitely work with many great partners that can help with that.
And you are correct, Vadim. That is something, Ronnie, that we could help you out with.
Great. So we have 10 minutes left. And what I wanted to do in the last 10 minutes is show some of the power of automation when it comes to image patching. Again, so what I just showed you is a way of manually making changes to the image. But let's say you wanted to do this on an automated recurring basis. So here's an example. So I have an image here. Let's take this marketing image since we've been working with it. I'm going to click on the Power Office Set as Image button. But now, instead of clicking Run Now, I'm going to set up a schedule. And I'm going to say that I want this to happen 2 days after Patch Tuesday. So figure that's going to be Thursday of whichever week. I think it's third week of the month, but whenever that is, right? So 2 days after Patch Tuesday, we're going to have this operation run. When the operation runs, I want to refresh my image from the Azure Marketplace, which means I'll get Microsoft's latest patched version of an image. And in my case, I'll go with, let's say, the latest version of Windows 10 with Pro Plus on it. I can join it to my domain. I can then run my custom scripts that are going to install my apps. So let's say I'm going to install Teams and Chrome and Adobe and whatever else I need. And then I'm also going to stage this image as inactive. Staging an image creates it and does all of the stuff that we just talked about, but it doesn't get automatically consumed by the production host pool until this image is tested and labeled as active, right? So we're just going to check this one checkbox and the automation will handle everything else for us. So I'm going to click Save and Close. And what that will do is it will create a scheduled task, and you can see it right here, a little alarm clock. And this alarm clock is going to update my marketing image, keeping the existing one exactly as is. It will create a new version of it, install the apps, pull the latest version from the marketplace, do whatever we needed to do, replicate it into all the different locations, and then create a staged version, which is going to be newer. So in our case, we have an active version is 2.00. Staged version will end up being version 3.00. And now what you can do is you can have two different host pools. You can have one host pool that's your production host pool that all of the users are assigned to and they're using it on a production basis. And you can have a pre-prod or testing or validation or UAT, whatever term you want to use. You can have another host pool that's used with a smaller group of users that can consume that newly updated image as soon as it becomes available, right? So imagine, again, you have two host pools. So let's actually go ahead and create one. So let's say staging host pool and staging. Let's select our staged version of some image and click OK. So we'll now see two host pools. And what we'll do is we will schedule a recurring re-image job that's going to run on both host pools. One is going to run with the staged version of the image on the staging host pool. And the one that's production is going to run with the active version. Okay, so let's wait for this to complete. We don't need autoscale, so I'm going to cancel it. Okay, so here's our staging host pool. So what I'll do is I'll go to hosts, re-image. I will select my staged version, right? This is a staged version. I'm going to schedule it to run after Patch Tuesday. Let's say instead of 2 days or 3 days, let's say 4 days after Patch Tuesday. And I'm going to say save and close. So now I'm going to have a staged version being applied to this host pool. And then on the production host pool, I'm going to do the same kind of operation. I'm going to say hosts re-image. I'm going to take the production version. I will do a schedule. I will say, after patch Tuesday, maybe 10 days, and do save and close. Now, what will happen is this active version of the image won't change until I click a button. And I'm going to click that button when I hear from my staging group or my UAT group of users that everything looks good. So once that happens, if we jump back into the desktop images page, you'll see that whenever there is a staged version, we can have a button in the dropdown called Activate Staged Image. When we activate the staged image, we can keep the current one as a backup if we wanted to. It's a good idea to do that sometimes. Once you click OK, the next time the production host pool will get re-imaged, it will pull in the now newly active image, which happens to be the one that we created and tested. So let me kind of just wrap it all up and summarize what we did. We created a schedule on an image to create a brand new version on a monthly basis after Microsoft patches everything, but we're going to stage that version and not push it out into production. We have a host pool that will automatically consume that image, that staged image, a couple of days later with a group of users that are assigned for testing it. Once those users are done testing and approve that image, you click one button to activate it. And then within a few days, the production host pool is going to start consuming that new production version of the image automatically that has now been activated after being updated. So I think I will stop here. We covered a good amount, but certainly only scratched the surface of the capabilities of Nerdio Manager. But I think this should give you an idea of the types of things that you can do, and also the simplicity and the automation and the care we've taken by listening to our customers, understanding how they're managing desktops at scale in Azure, and what we can do to make their job simpler, easier, and more automated. So I think I'm going to stop here.
Thanks, Vadim. I appreciate you having the time today to be with us. And I'm sure everyone here in attendance is appreciative of your time as well. I did want to offer it out one more time if anybody had any additional questions that you want to bring it up in Q&A or in the chat now, and we can get those addressed real quickly. If not, feel free to follow up to go ahead and follow up with any additional questions you may have once we're completed, and we'll make sure that we get those answers for you as soon as possible. So again, Vadim, thank you for being here today. We'll definitely have to set something up so we can go into some different features and functionalities other than what we covered today.
Great, thanks for having me, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you.